Welcome everybody to CircleID's first community dialogue. We are pleased to welcome what we hope will be a series of conversations about the impact of COVID on the internet. Today is about asking questions and about a broad range of issues. We may not have the answers, but we hope to hone in on what industry leaders are thinking about in real time and where we should be heading in terms of forming public and private solutions to new and amplified issues surrounding internet policy and governance. We have a dynamic panel of experienced executives and thought leaders ready to share their perspectives on the decisions and adaptations that have been required to scale up to meet the COVID challenge. The format today will be fairly open. I will introduce the panelists, and each one will take a few minutes to discuss how their organizations are responding to the COVID challenge. We will then open the Zoom room to questions. Participants are strongly encouraged to use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen. For those on laptops and PCs, that will be at the bottom of the screen in the middle. Questions will only be taken from the Q&A feature. Attendees will also be able to chat publicly. There will be no private chat, as we have opted not to display the attendee list for privacy reasons. Before we would begin, I would like to thank Ali Farshian and the CircleID team for opening this discussion space, and to Klaus Stoll and Sam Lanfranco for their support in planning and running the event. The webcast will be posted for future viewing, and a follow-up blog will be posted on CircleID to ask for your feedback and suggestions for future discussions. URLs for resources referenced in the discussion will also be available in the blog. And I'm just reminding anyone to please mute unless you are speaking. And so we will begin. It's my great pleasure to introduce friends and colleagues who've been very hard at work for the past few months, making sure that the internet doesn't break, while it seems that sometimes parts of the world may be breaking. That said, I would like to introduce Caroline Greer. She is the head of policy for Cloudflare, a web performance and security company offering a wide range of infrastructure and application solutions. Caroline leads Cloudflare's European public policy and advocacy initiatives. She addresses a wide range of digital policy goals. Her particular focus is on privacy and data protection, intermediary liability, and content moderation. She's an active member of the ICANN community, and she's a member of the board of the I2 Coalition, which helps foster the growth of internet infrastructure in industry and ensures that legislation and policy initiatives are not harmful to services sitting at the public core of the internet. Our next speaker will be Joran Marby, CEO for the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, as we all refer to as ICANN. ICANN's mission is to secure the security, stability, and interoperability of the internet and to promote competition and consumer choice. Its mission is achieved through the coordination of the names, numbers, and protocols that enable the internet to operate. Prior to his taking the helm at ICANN, Joran was the Director General of the Swedish Post and Telecom Authority and the CEO for several tech companies based in Sweden. And in case you haven't guessed, Joran's Swedish. I'm very proud then to introduce Gretchen Ramos. She is the co-chair of Data Privacy and Cybersecurity at Greenberg Traurig in San Francisco, California. She focuses her practice on privacy, cybersecurity, and information management. Gretchen's clients come from diverse industries, including technology, healthcare, life sciences, consumer products, manufacturing, academic institutions, and nonprofits. She provides clients with practical business advice on compliance and on state and federal U.S. laws, including the California Consumer Privacy Act, the EU General Directive on Privacy Regulation, known as GDPR, the Asia-Pacific Cooperative Privacy Framework, and other global privacy laws. Stephen Lee, who is next, is the Chief Executive Officer of Architects, a US-based technology firm with a strong foot in the Caribbean. Architects offers a full range of services, including VoIP implementation, electronic banking support, and cloud productivity services. Before joining Architects, Mr. Lee served in senior executive positions at technology companies in Jamaica and the United States. He is consulting advisor to the Caribbean Telecommunications Union and a founding member of the Caribbean Network Operators Group, a volunteer-based forum for network administrators. He also serves as a facilitator with Bright Path Foundation. This is an international technology education nonprofit organization. And last, but absolutely not least, is Jorge Contreras, who is the presidential scholar and professor of law at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Before entering academia, Professor Contreras was a partner at an international law firm where he practiced transactional and intellectual property law. His research focuses, among other things, on intellectual property, technical standards, and scientific data. He is the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters and the editor of six books. Professor Contreras was one of the founders of the Open COVID Coalition, a nonprofit organization that seeks to open intellectual property for use in the fight against COVID-19. Along with his legal degree, George has an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering. So as you can see from this very rich pool of experience, we should have a very good conversation and leapboarding into issues that are important to the CircleID community and to the community at large. And I'm going to ask Carolyn to please kick it off.
Thanks very much, Laurie. And yeah, very happy to do that. Thank you very much for joining everybody, for taking the time to do that in these challenging times. I know everybody has very busy schedules, everybody's Zooming everywhere. So thanks for taking the time to join us today. So maybe, at least to frame the discussion from my perspective, I thought it might be interesting to say a few words on how Cloudflare has adapted to this unique situation that we've all faced in the last couple of months. So as Laurie mentioned, Cloudflare is a cybersecurity and web performance company. We have over 1,200 employees at the minute and some 200 data centers around the world. So we have, I think 13 offices around the world as well. I think the moving to the online environment was okay for us. That worked relatively smoothly given the dispersed nature of all of our offices. We were all able to move to that online working environment relatively easily. And we're a security company, right? So we already had all those functionalities set up in order to have a secure working environment operating effectively. So that wasn't so much of an issue at all. We had to get some equipment to our employees, to have better working environments at home. But all of that was relatively simple, thank God. Video conferencing is very much a part of my daily life. My team is actually in the US, so I'm very much used to doing exactly what we're doing today, connecting with people via video conference. We've continued to hire throughout this process as Cloudflare. So we've continued to do orientation. We've moved that to an online orientation. We're really conscious that a lot of people are in a difficult situation at the minute. We really think a lot about students and people that were ready to take internships at this time. It really is a bit of a challenge for them. So we've actually upped our commitment this summer and we're taking on a double intake of interns this summer, albeit it's an online internship, so that's a little bit different, but it's something that we thought that we could do that might help some people. In terms of our data centers, so I mentioned we had some 200 data centers. We haven't really faced too many challenges in either getting access to the data centers or moving equipment around the world. And I think a lot of that has gone to, attributed to the fact that governments have very quickly reacted and have seen that data centers are essential infrastructure and that data center workers and contractors that are moving equipment around the world or installing equipment locally are really, this is an essential function and these are essential workers. So that has gone pretty well, and a big shout out to various trade associations that have helped in that front, I2C and ECHO in particular, Internet Infrastructure associations that have really helped to push and bring an understanding to the fact that internet infrastructure really is critical at this time more than ever. And now as a company, we're focused on what the next stage looks like, right? Whatever that looks like, it's trying to plan about how we get back to some semblance of normality, whatever that looks like. And that depends on, what people feel comfortable with, what the local law, what the local guidelines look like. So all in all, as a company, I think we've been able to adapt pretty well, pretty quickly. So not too many issues there. In terms of our customers, so we have a broad range of customers, ranging from small businesses, SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, right up to government agencies. I think the biggest change for many businesses has been that they've had to move rapidly without expecting it to a remote working environment, and one that is secure. And that has almost happened overnight. We have a solution for that as Cloudflare. We have a Cloudflare for Teams product that enables that. But we've really wanted to help companies and organizations, and indeed government agencies that are facing a lot of stress, perhaps on some of their websites, to do that very rapidly and quickly. So as many tech companies have, we've actually had an offer open to organizations of all sizes, to government agencies, to use what we call Cloudflare for Teams, a product that enables workforces to go online securely and work in a secure remote environment. And that's something that we have running through September 1st. So, we're not alone in being a tech company on that front and having something to offer. Our thinking there is that, security is so important online, and we have a role to play in that. And we all stand to lose if some section of the community is facing some threat or risk. So, we really want to help everybody have a safe, secure online environment. So that's what we've been focusing on. We've many different hats as a company. We mostly a DNS business, a CDN, caching business. We have a domain registrar as well, which sort of falls into the ICANN community. I think as many registrars, we have a abuse reporting process that has still been functioning as it has been for any covert related abuse. We haven't seen, we've seen spikes, peaks and troughs, I think, over the weeks, but nothing that we haven't been able to deal with. So using the tools and processes that we have, we've been able to deal with that. And I think maybe Joran will probably speak to that later on, what the DNS industry and specifically has been able to do to tackle abuse on the DNS level. On the cybersecurity front, we have seen different trends, I think, in some of the cybersecurity attacks that we've seen. A lot more people are spending a lot more time online. So often what we see is that this is a day job for many people. So you sort of see the peaks and troughs in the cyber attacks that are happening. They're happening during the day and then they fall away at night. So, this has kind of been an interesting dynamic in terms of the timing of attacks. In some cases, the type of cyber attacks. But all in all, I think, that's been manageable. We've also seen some very interesting things in terms of the network, what we've seen in terms of internet trends, and I'll probably speak about that later on in the session. But it's been a really interesting time. I think we've all risen to the challenge. I think most of us have. We've been able to meet that. And we probably have a lot of lessons to draw from this time, which I'd be really interested to talk about with the group, what we can take from this experience, what we can bring forward, and how we can get back to a better situation, take the good from this and learn something.
Thank you, Caroline. I would agree. I think as stressful as it's been, there's been an enormous amount of good. And we've really seen the industry come together, and we're going to talk about specific projects. Joran will address one as well as George. So yes, I think there is a time to really look for the silver lining in a lot of what we do. And I'm going to hand it all over to Joran Marby.
Thank you, and first of all, thank you for inviting me to this. I'm really excited for this panel, and like everybody else, I also sort of enjoy actually seeing people in such a way on Zoom. So just to start off a little bit, what ICANN actually is, because ICANN is many things to many different people, but we do have a sort of underlying mission in life, and that is to ensure the stable and secure operations of Internet unique identifiers. We are the technical coordinator of the top level Internet domain name systems. I will try to refrain of using too many acronyms, and we are the operator of the IANA functions. So therefore, we ensure that domain names and IP addresses are unique and enables a single unified interoperable internet. And so my first remark about it, I mean, so ICANN is, despite what some people sometimes think, we are a technical organization that has grown up over the years with the help of what we call the ICANN community. I will come back a little bit about that. But I want to do one thing that Caroline mentioned is that it's sort of over the years there has always been discussions about alternative technologies and alternative setups and alternatives because it doesn't work. I think that for me this period has shown that the underlying functionality of the internet itself has proven working very well. We have seen more people coming online. We've seen more people using the internet for different purposes, and it's been very, very stable. So I sort of lift my hat to the original designers of this, Steve Crocker, Windsurf, and the other ones, because they actually did construct something that actually maintained, worked very well through a period like this. And I think that's important to remember, that the underlying functionality has been there. So ICANN is a non-for-profit organization. We are governed by what we call the ICANN community. And I would like to take this opportunity to say a big thanks to the ICANN community, which consists of thousands of volunteers. Some of them are in this call, who participates in setting the rules for ICANN. I'm the CEO. I implement the rules that is set by the community. And we decided very early on, we were quite early when we decided not to do one of our major meetings in Mexico a while back ago. And I have to admit that I'm also very impressed by the ICANN community, who hasn't missed a beat when it comes to continue the important discussion about the governance of the rules that is set on us. Big thanks for that. They've been able to evolve very fast into this situation. So to echo a little bit what everybody else says is that, yes, of course, we've seen during this period of time people who takes advantage of this situation. And we see them in bad domain names, we see them in potential frauds, we see them in many different ways. And ICANN has a responsibility for this as well. It's framed, we don't do content. It's a very, we sometimes call it limited. It's just that it's limited in the sense that this is the things that ICANN actually can do something about. But we have seen a spike in fraudulent behavior on the internet over this period of time. As we often see, I mean, this is not unique for this period. When we have when natural disasters happens around the world, we see the same thing. When things becomes a hot topic on the internet, we see the same things happening. So as Caroline said, it's not new to us. We are dealing with this the same way we always deal with it. It's just that the magnitude is probably bigger, it's global than regional. I mean, when we see natural disasters in parts of the world, we see people trying to use that all the time, and we have built into the system trying to do something about that. So there are two things really. One of them is the work that we're doing together with the contracting. We call them the contracting parties, the ones who holds the domain names or either resells domain names. The top level domain owners, you know them in the last two letters in any domain names. We work very closely with them, and I would like to thank them. We formed coalitions and worked very well to them over this period of time with a special focus on the COVID-19 problems. And working against this kind of abuse has been important for the whole ecosystem because everybody feels about it. And it was really, I learned I think this is an English expression, all hands on deck. It's been really much all hands on deck. And we've been working very hard with people to recognize how to deal with this going. And we're learning things, which we will learn in the future as well. One thing that is also happening, which I want to point out, is that we sort of talked about using the domain name system for fraudulent behavior. The other ones are attacks on the actual domain name systems as well. And yesterday I launched a new initiative to look into that as well, because if any part of the domain name systems around the world gets attacked, if a top level domain gets compromised, a lot of things is insecure under that domain name system as well. And we have seen over the last couple of years more of those attacks coming in, and we're putting more and more effort into it. That's a collaboration thing with us, between us and the top level domain owners around the world. But we shouldn't forget that. It's such an essential part of your ability to connect to the internet. So I would say that the ICANN response to what we call DNS abuse, whatever you want to call it, is sort of always multifaceted, and it's built on the rules and procedures set by the ICANN community, which is very important, which you also see in our bylaws. And the reason why we define that so well, and the community define it so well, is also to make sure that we don't interfere in areas we don't have competence in. It's very important for us. ICANN should be a technical organization with a technical remit. A lot of the other issues should be dealt with in other places as well. So, just for you, ICANN is a multifaceted organization as well. We work with our own compliance group department, where we make sure that the contracted parties follows the rules set by the community. But especially in the case of COVID-19, we also work very closely with the contracting party works very closely with our office of the CTO called Octo with a more direct approach to this. And I know that I will receive some questions later when I would talk a little bit about the practical work we've done. So, but in all of this, I'm apart from everything else, I think I'm proud of how well this ecosystem has handled many of those issues. We haven't solved all issues. We're learning all the time. This is a new situation for many of us. We're doing things remotely that we've never done before. For instance, ICANN is going to do our next meeting. We're going to do a remote meeting remotely, when all our support staff are actually going to sit at home doing things, anything from technical support to translations. And the ICANN community members are sitting at home doing the same things. And it's kind of remarkable how all this ecosystem, also the way the numbers community is working, the ITF is working, everybody who's engaged in this ecosystem has really, really done a fantastic job. And it gives me a strength of that the multi-stakeholder model and this bottom-up approach to internet governance actually works. And I think that's a good message going forward. And I'm really proud of being a part of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Göran. I think that was a great introduction to the work of ICANN, and I'm going to then switch it over to sort of a public interest entity serving the public good in terms of making sure that the internet doesn't break, to a private legal practitioner based in San Francisco, Gretchen Ramos, to talk about her privacy and security practice, and practice in general, and give us some thoughts about what she's seeing with her clients and her own approach to her work.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for setting this up. We have a great panel and it's great. And I think to echo kind of what several of the speakers have said, although this seems like a bad situation, in many ways it's a good situation. Because on the privacy front, what's happened is people are starting to realize, okay, we need to balance this privacy stuff with our pandemic we're dealing with. So in some ways we're in a privacy paradox because, we had GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation out there that lots of companies focused on coming into compliance with in 2018. The US started to get on board with the California Consumer Privacy Act, which was effective this year, beginning of this year, and will be enforced on July 1st. And then all of this kind of throws a wrench into a lot of that. Because with the contact tracing apps that are being pushed out, with other health monitoring, AI on screening that's being thought about by retailers and restaurants to make sure social distancing is going on, all of these bring up a ton of issues on the privacy front, which we were already, everyone's struggling with compliance already, given all these laws and kind of what they need to do. So, but even though we're struggling with it, it's bringing privacy to the forefront. There's lots of issues. There's no question about it. There's issues about the tracing apps and the management of the data. And if we're going to use that, the contact tracing apps would be great, but they're huge privacy concerns. Really difficult to collect this information and not be collecting any personal information. And then what do you do with that information? So, I mean, the number of issues we're dealing with on the privacy front is huge. It's amazing though that we have these issues. And I think going back to this is a test of the internet, what Corin was saying is totally right. This is an amazing test of the internet and how we all share data and the fact that it stood up and that we can actually do a lot of these things. We just need to do it right. And that's where, you know, we can't rush to have everyone downloading these apps and collecting everyone's data and then having the government or other companies collecting this data and keeping it and, you know, using it for purposes that people didn't intend. So I deal with companies across the board. You know, as Lori said, we've been very busy on the employee front, you know, lots of companies wanting to screen employees and getting ready for, you know, reopening the economy and coming back to work. And, you know, what are the rules around this? There are lots of rules coming out in different states, in different countries, and it's very, very difficult for companies to stay on top of these. And so we're in a very challenging atmosphere right now around the privacy front. And, you know, if we lack some of these privacy rights that we have now because we're in a pandemic, that might be the right thing to do, but, you know, making sure that we have the system in place to step back and make sure that doesn't become the norm and, you know, we come back to our privacy rules is going to be really key here. So, you know, welcome to discuss any questions, but, you know, that's, we're in an interesting space in the privacy front right now and more to come for sure.
Thank you, Gretchen. I think there's an overarching question that I'll ask the group later, but I'll ask you to start thinking about it now because you've teed it up. And that is, you know, how have the scales shifted in terms of security versus individual freedom? And to your point, if we decide right now one way is heavier than the other, how do we shift it back? Because once a law is enacted, as you know, it's very difficult to repeal or even a policy. So something to think about. And with that in mind, I'm going to shift over to Stephen Lee, have him give his thoughts about what's going on in his industry and particularly how it's affecting the Caribbean. Because as we are wont to do in this industry, the European community, the US community, we tend to kind of take up a lot of the space in the discussions about impacts of COVID and what we're doing from a policy perspective in Brussels and Washington. But there are, as we know, many other communities that have different challenges than we do. And we're very welcome to have Stephen. I mean, very lucky to have Stephen, and Stephen is very welcome.
All right, thank you, Laura. Thanks, thanks everyone. Really great panel and discussion today. I hope that this dialogue continues since we all have to kind of get used to this new normal. I'm from, as Laurie introduced, I'm from a business which serves companies inside of the Caribbean region. But the perspective I'll speak from today is more my nonprofit side. I'm one of the co-founders of CaribNOG, that's a Caribbean Network Operators Group, which is a technical community that is dedicated to support of the internet infrastructure inside of the Caribbean region. So this would be dissemination of technical knowledge, help with establishment of best practices, lots of training and just development of the technical community. So the members of CaribNOG would be your people who have to administer the public networks. This would be engineers who would, the equivalent, they would be working at Verizon or AT&T and so on, as well as network engineers in private companies, organizations, civil society and government. And so from that perspective, we have a good view through our members of what's taking place in the technology, in the area of the technology infrastructure inside of the Caribbean region. And as with everywhere else, what we've seen is a rapid movement to business and society, moving operations online. And a lot of the challenges that have been coming up, or just let's just call them issues that people are dealing with, is how do I take my day-to-day life, my transactions, my banking, the operations of my office, and put that in an online context. And so we've the technical industry has been getting a lot of questions and have been asked to solve problems around remote access, VPNs. Should I try to connect to my office or should we put everything in the cloud and everybody work through browsers and so on? That's basically the majority of the conversation that's going on in the in the tech industry in the Caribbean region. And of course, people are finding different ways of solving these problems. And like Laurie indicated, what's going on at Cloudflare, lots of companies have made new facilities available for remote working. Those are being adopted very quickly. But I'd say one of the significant things that has emerged though is in addition to the companies and individuals availing themselves of new technology services, there's a huge concern over the impact on the network and the sustainability of this particular model. And so we've been talking inside of CaribNOG a lot recently about the importance of the domestic or local internet infrastructures. And just to paint the picture a little bit more, a lot of the Caribbean nations would have, there are a few of them with like Jamaica and Trinidad with million+ populations. But we also have a lot of populations, national populations in the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. So you're talking about an island with 80,000, 90,000 people, 200, 300,000 people, and so on. And so the markets are smaller, the economies are smaller. And when a lot of the traffic leaves the Caribbean region, as it does today, and switches in Miami, it costs the region a lot. And so when more and more services have to be consumed from the global cloud, as is the norm and has always been the norm, I think everybody has been very happy to have that, because it meant that a lot of low-cost services could be accessed inside of the Caribbean region. But with the massive economic impact, it's just not as affordable as it was 6 months ago. And people are starting to question the sustainability of continuing to consume services in that way. And so we have a big conversation going on today about improving the domestic internet infrastructure, allow schools, allow businesses to do a lot more transactions online. Certainly the things that need to come from outside, everybody's gonna keep using Netflix and streaming YouTube and so on, so no question there. But my banking transactions, my legal transactions, the online education, how much of that can we keep within the national borders so that we can reduce costs and make it a lot more sustainable over long term, and just businesses getting along with their business on faster domestic internet connections. That's where a lot of the concern is, and happy to talk more about those things as we go forward.
Okay. Thank you so much, Stephen. That's extremely interesting, because I do think, yeah, where the money is important in terms of moving forward, and how the private sector and governments and civil society will respond to these infrastructure problems. They're not unlike what we saw 20 years ago or 30 years ago when we were actually building the infrastructure. Now it's like we've got to build it up to the next level, whatever that is. And then last but certainly not least is Jorge Contreras, who's here to talk about his work and one particular initiative that could help maybe alleviate some of the cost pressures and some of the pressures we're seeing in scaling up through an open source initiative. George, take it away.
Great, Lori. Thanks so much. And thanks for inviting me to be part of this really interesting panel. So my full-time job is as an academic, but over the last couple of months, I have been working with a group of volunteers, scientists, and legal academics, policy experts from around the world on something called the Open COVID Pledge. And this is an idea that was sparked by news stories that were starting to appear that intellectual property rights were starting to become problematic for groups that were trying to address the pandemic in one way or another. People 3D printing parts for ventilators that needed to be repaired, distribution of different medical supplies, non-practicing entities asserting patents against entities that are working, again, to end the pandemic. And so it occurred to a number of us simultaneously, sort of independently, that we could use some sort of mechanism to enable intellectual property to be put out for public use for purposes of alleviating the pandemic, right? Not given away entirely or permanently, but made available for broad use for those who are working against COVID-19. I mean, there are many proposals in this area that have been made over the last couple of months, everything from compulsory licensing by certain countries to require that companies give intellectual property rights to others to make these products and do research and development, to patent pools. The United Nations, the World Health Organization are leading some efforts in that regard. But the thing that we thought we could help with was something much more simple and straightforward and lightweight, which is to create a platform for the pledging of intellectual property toward the alleviation of COVID-19. There is a history of these types of patent pledges and intellectual property pledges going back to standards development. Just tying into the comments about ICANN, I spent 20 years as the legal counsel to the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, which also has something to do with the technical aspects of the internet. But in standards organizations, the companies that participate typically make commitments that they will not assert their patents, or that they'll assert their patents, or they'll only charge reasonable royalties for their patents just to get everybody to adopt the standard. And we thought something similar to that could be done with COVID-19. So we created a simple one-sentence pledge that is posted at opencovidpledge.org that says we pledge to make our intellectual property available free of charge for use in ending the COVID-19 pandemic and minimizing the impact of the disease. Any company, institution, university around the world can publicly adopt that pledge. And if they do, all they have to do is make a public statement that they've done that, and then create sort of a free open use license agreement that goes along with that. Something like a Creative Commons license or an open source code license, not something that requires it to be signed or negotiated, but something that's very easy and lightweight to adopt. We have a template that pledgors are welcome to use, or they can create their own, and we will certify it sort of like OSI does for open source code licenses as being compliant. The main points, the principal terms of this license are that it's free, there's no charge associated with it, and that it's of a limited term, that the duration of this license only lasts during the term of the WHO declared COVID-19 pandemic, plus a year ramp down period with an outside date of January 1, 2023. So that after that time period or outside of the field of COVID-19, these entities still can commercialize their IP rights however they otherwise would have. We tried to make this fairly pared down and easy to understand, which does not include provisions like grant backs or share-alike clauses like you see in the GPL brand of open source code licenses. It does not constrain the pricing that downstream users can place on products that they make under the licensed IP. Again, all of that is to create as lightweight and easy to adopt a framework as possible. It may or may not be attractive then to some entities, but our view was hopefully we would get the most by making this as easy to adopt as possible. And it was released formally on April 7th, so exactly 1 month ago. We've gotten some pretty good traction. A number of large companies have signed up and made the pledge, particularly of interest. In this setting, we have a number of large IT and cloud-related companies: Intel, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, AT&T, and IBM are among the companies that have taken the Open COVID Pledge. And we've got a smattering of small companies, a national laboratory, a university, a coalition of UK ventilator makers, even a grocery store designer who has intellectual property in creating grocery store layouts that allow social distancing. Right? All of this IP is available for use without charge. And so it's really creates a unique environment, one that we haven't seen before, in which there are literally hundreds of thousands of patents around the world that have been made available for use to address this pandemic. And our hope is that as a result of that, people will be innovative, especially on the sort of IT, web, cloud side. There are any number of patents and copyrights that relate to social networking, algorithms for disease modeling, contact tracing, fraud detection that are useful. They're being used today. And this opens up a great opportunity for developers and members of the public, people in other companies, startups around the world to basically look at that big toolbox, see what might be useful, and innovate so that we can all contribute to dealing with this crisis. That's the summary of it.
Thank you, George. I think it sounds really exciting. I was super excited to hear about the grocery aisles because I know just personally that's been a super concern. These really, we can sit here and think about high-level issues, right? General internet policy, contact tracing. Joran referred to the multi-stakeholder model and ICANN's policy development process, which is incredibly intense and technical. But there's some real-world things going on, like, yeah, I've got to go out and get vegetables. Am I risking my life? Am I risking? It sounds funny, but it actually, in some regards, is exactly where we are. So I think this is super useful as we advertised this event, we said the internet has become a matter of life and death in a way that we really haven't thought about before. And so having these practical issues come up, as long as sort of with the more higher level issues that we tend to look at as policy people or legal people, I think brings us really back to home and down to earth in a way that is important to remind us that what we're doing is going to have an effect, at the grocery store or wherever. So I want to thank everybody for their introductions and their thoughts. And now's the good part. Now we get to speak with the audience and speak with each other and try to make some sense out of the spaghetti sort of that we have here in terms of policies, the initiatives. And what I'd like to do, just for the benefit of the audience, we do have some prepared questions, but also to make this more interesting and dynamic, we have encouraged people to ask questions. And I noticed now there's 2 in the Q&A, and we got 2 before the conference even started. So while it might appear a little random, in fairness to the participants, and by those I mean the attendees who submitted questions early as opposed to the panelists, I'm going to go and ask the questions from the audience first. And then we can kind of shift back into a more structured conversation. So 2 of the questions have already been seen. The first question was directed to Joran and to ICANN and ICANN's initiatives with filtering out and finding potentially abusive domain names before they even hit the market, which I think is definitely admirable. And we did have a question about telehealth, which sounds like Steve and Gretchen and George might have a nice insight on. So I will start with those 2 questions and off we go. So Joran, the first question comes from a panelist, and the panelist from an attendee, and the attendee correctly states, which with each and every crisis since the inception of the internet, from Katrina to Fukushima and beyond, the domain naming system has been a fertile ground for attacks that target unsuspecting victims, donors, and others. We've just heard of the advanced work that ICANN Security Organization is flagging domains that are abusive for ICANN accredited registrars in a briefing of the registrar's constituency this past Monday. And Goran, you had already referred to that in your opening remarks. It's wonderful work. Congratulations to you and your team. How could ICANN make this part of your process and require that the data be actioned for this crisis, future issues, or as an ongoing process?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for I can speak at length this one, so I will try to keep myself a little bit short. So what we're doing is that we're trying to, through reputational feeds and other things, trying to flag, to try to find names. And just to diverge a little bit, one of the problems is actually what you would call false positives. Because, so just to give an example, that we have detected about 80, so there's been discussion about the 80,000 plus new names that were bad. So we have, since we began our effort in the end of March, we've seen an average, and I have to look at the numbers now so I don't get it wrong, 3,250 new domain names per day that matches our search terms, which relates in more than 82,000 names. But of those 82,000 names, we found evidence to link approximately 7,000 of those names to malicious behaviors. Which we worked with the contracted party, top level domain owners, registrars, to resolve. It's important to see that yes, we have a problem and the system actually works to do that. But it's also very important that we don't create false positives in this one. So we don't give the opportunity. I was just looking at the domain name that was posted for this fantastic initiative from George. Which contains the word opencovidpledge.org. I mean, that because it contains the words, it was actually flagged in many systems, but then you actually have to look at it so you don't close it down. So there is a lot of numbers in all of this. So what we're trying to do, I mean, this is a learning experience, so we work very closely with the contracted parties about it. And we try to make sure that we are as transparent as possible in the processes of this. I know in the ICANN community, the abuse discussion has had for a very long time a high priority, and I think that we're learning from this to go forward. But it's very much up to the ICANN community as well to set the rules for going forward with this. We do several things in this area. We have something, and I'm sorry for the acronyms, the DAR system, which produces report about abuse in general in the market. We have something called the health indicators, where you can, with the best user interface in the world, if you started your program career in the 80s, where you can see a lot of the data in real time, how the system works. So we are just adding new tools for the help of other ones. But I thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Jörn. I have a follow-up question of my own on this in terms of the numbers that you give. I want to make sure I heard right. Of the 80,000, 7,000 were bad, or 7D, which was?
7,000 names. We found evidence to link approximately 7,000 names to malicious behavior.
Okay, so we're talking then less than 10%.
Yeah.
I wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, that's. And I don't want to understress. I mean, this is important. I mean, these 7,000 names are important to deal with. So it's not like I'm saying that. This is we don't have to do anything about it, because of course we have to do. What I'm trying to say is that we have to make sure that we don't do false positives. So we don't block people's ability to register domain names just because they contain a name.
Yeah, were those 80,000 manually looked at, or just ran through an algorithm? I don't know. You said 7,000 were bad. Was it simply the algorithm telling you?
We have a system where we look at different sources, and I'm sure David Conrad my CTO can dive into this very much more than I do. We will come out with more information, but yes, we have search criteria where we look into different places and we collect this data, but we haven't been able to automate it in such a way that we actually do some manual labor to it as well. So it's because we started doing this fairly short time ago, and then we distribute and have connections with the registrar industry who are in this process and talk to them directly. We would like to automate more portions of the systems going forward. We also have to take things into account, and I'm now not complaining, but we also have things like GDPR to take into account, etc., etc. So we're trying to work that out as we're doing it. But there's a portion of manual labor into it as well right now.
Yeah, I do want to, again, follow up just another two with the government cooperation that may or may not be happening with this initiative. I didn't read your briefing. So, and given how new it is, I'm going to assume that most people listening have not. And just ask, are you working with specific governments? I know here in the US, we have Operation Lost Promise, where there have been, I think as of yesterday, 20,000 domain names looked at and seized essentially for COVID-related fraud. And I want to know if this program that you're doing is working with programs like this, and if so, which governments?
So we work, I mean, so internet, when it comes to the domain name systems, is an ecosystem. And so in our rule book, so to say, we talk about the top level domain operators, and then we have our friends who sets policies for the country code operators as well. And what has been fairly fantastic in all this process is how, I mean, so we domain name systems and the end operations has a very technical path, but we do policies differently within the ecosystem. The numbers community makes policies for the distribution of IP addresses, and do a hell of a job of that. And again, IETF is making the standardization for protocols, even if they're contained in our environment. And the CC, the country code operators, are doing their own policies individually. What I think has been amazing in this one is that many of us has come together so much. I mean, we don't contain the data in that sense. We don't have databases for who is, et cetera, not a well-known subject. But so now it's really been all hands on deck and communicating with each other, with companies like Cloudflare and everybody else, and they've been very responsive to this. So yes, we are talking to governments as well, but many of the questions for the governments has been about the utilization, because they often work with their own country code operators. And with that said, we receive questions from individual countries or regions of countries where they ask us about the overall usage of the domain name systems. So and how well that has been functioning in this period. For instance, I can tell you that when we checked several countries. One of them was France, just to go out of the US, where I think we saw a 20% increase of questions into domain name systems, and we didn't have any problems with it from a technical perspective. We have, I mean, for anybody who doesn't know, through in one part of the ICANN system is what we call the GAC, where we have 170 countries as members of the GAC, governmental representatives, and we also work a lot through the GAC and we are through the GAC of having conversations with individual countries. But it's been a very positive exercise, I would say. Because you just asked a question, I'm going to add something to it.
Sure.
One of the things I feel really encouraged about it is that we're going back to something that I think that we sometimes forget: the knowledge of the end user. Because many of those problems we are talking about is actually about where we probably haven't been able to train end users the way they should. You know, clean your cache, update your operating systems, be aware. All of those things for a long period of time sort of got forgotten. And I think that one of the interesting aspects of this crisis has been that now the focus on the knowledge base of the end users can help a lot in the information security space is getting back. And I think that's a very positive thing. And I think we, as part of this ecosystem, regardless if you're industry or anyone else, probably at the end of this has to start talking about the better interactions with the end users of the world, what they can do to protect themselves as well. Not only from a technical perspective, but also a knowledge-based perspective. What is fake news? What could be wrong? How do you check it, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry.
Thank you, Göran. I think that's an excellent point about the end user, because at the end of the day, all the work that we're doing affects the end user. And there can be a tendency when you're speaking at the policy level to forget that, quite frankly, because we're so normally used to interacting with governments and the private sector versus or any other in terms of the average person on the street. So be it. I think Caroline, you might have something to add in terms of how you respond as a registrar, since you're part of the initiative. Yeah. I just wanted to clarify, the U.S. operation is called Operation Stolen Promise. I think I may have referred to it as Broken Promise. So thanks. Go ahead.
So noted. Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, just adding on to what Göran said. So with my registrar hat on, one service that Cloudflare has, this has been an extremely active discussion within the registrar group. So how do we deal with this very new, fast-moving situation. So we published a framework as the registrar stakeholder group, which outlined the different tools that we have as a registrar group. I think it's important to understand that, okay, not only as businesses are we confronting the challenges of COVID, you know, as businesses in a day-to-day operation, but there are very many different types of registrars: small registrars, large registrars, registrars with hosting services, registrars with email services, all of which have maybe different responsibilities and actions that they can take. And the false positives point that Joran made is extremely well taken. This has been a challenge. I mean, there have been a huge number of domain registrations with the word COVID or Corona included. But when you go to check some of them, they're actually good websites. You know, they're public information, public health websites. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a domain registration with this contained within the domain name string, that this is necessarily a bad, you know, domain registration. And then you're into a situation where you're asking registrars to assess the content of a website and assess the legitimacy of a testing website or a solution or, you know, a particular type of information. This is in many cases beyond the realm of what an internet infrastructure provider should be doing. It becomes very challenging when you're actually assessing, analyzing the content of a website of domain name registration. And the challenge as well is there's been no one authoritative source for this. You know, different countries may have agencies here and there that can provide information to the industry, but there's no one authoritative source. And this is an extremely fast-moving situation, very dynamic. So that challenge of the false positives and keeping on top of everything has been really quite something. But with the benefit of time, registrars have been assessing the situation, what we've seen at really ground working level in terms of DNS abuse. And we hope to issue an update on that shortly, which hopefully should be of some benefit to the community.
Thank you, Caroline. And to highlight for the audience, some of the issues that Caroline raises are in constant play and constant flux in terms of my own community, the brand owning community, where we understand that intellectual property infringement and abuse is a gateway to a lot of the technical fraud that we see on the internet. And to your point, how do we come up with a fair and balanced system while at the same time handling fraud and abuse even at the IP level on such a massive scale? It's a vexing question, one we've been discussing for many, many years at ICANN and will continue to, but absolutely acknowledging there are moments in time when we gather together to figure out a better way forward. I do have a question from someone in the audience about any idea of how many false negatives for fraud URLs get through, maybe taken down by others. The observation was this individual helped a registrar take one down last week. It had World Health Organization in the URL. So are we keeping data? Is there any way to know ones we think are okay, they're not okay? Some way to track them somewhere down the line to see how the filtering is actually working?
Maybe I could. No, Sam, we don't have a statistics on that. Well, and it's a little bit deep. Right now, we're also trying to figure out the measurements for that. I mean, this is getting slightly. So the domain name market itself contains of. We often talk about the top level domain owners, like the one who owns .com, for instance, .org, and other ones. And then you have the resellers, which are, and simplifying now, it's the registrars where you go in and actually buy the domain name. But there is a third category as well, which is often referred to as the domain speculators. Who go in and buy a domain name for speculative things so they down the road can sell it for a premium. And what we see during those periods, and I'm not judging on this business model, I'm just telling, is that you see a lot of domain name registration for speculative reasons. So when we actually check them, there's nothing there. They're not active. They go to a page where you can pay for a premium for them. So there's sort of a second wave, very popular phrasing right now, where someone might go in and buy a domain name for that has been on the speculation list and later becomes what we somewhat refer as abuse. So we sort of have to constantly mirroring things. So in the first order, when it's just registered by a speculator, is because it doesn't have any content, it doesn't have anything, it means that it's actually not malicious in any way. But in the next round, it might be malicious because someone bought it to make something malicious out of it. And that is, I think, complicates the structure of it. Not judging on the business model, not judging on the business ideas about this. These are more facts how it actually works.
Thank you. And I'm going to switch.
Thank you, Sam, for taking things down.
Yeah, taking down bad guys is a good thing. Yes, we need to reinforce that. I'm going to shift to the question about telehealth. I'm going to ask Gretchen to address it first, and I would imagine perhaps Stephen and George might have some insights here as well. And of course, Caroline and Joran, you're also welcome to add your thoughts. So the question coming from a participant is, what are the considerations on needed policies and procedures on the increased need for telehealth in COVID-19 response? How do we increase internet capacity that will enable individuals with limited data and internet capacity to access healthcare remotely?
The second part of that question, I don't have the answer to that. I'll leave it to somebody else. The first part of the question, a lot of states have basically lifted or issued orders putting aside all the telehealth requirements. In California, specifically where I'm from, they issued an order early in April saying that all the telehealth regulations are pretty much lifted so that people could continue to get healthcare without a company or a doctor having all the telehealth requirements in place, realizing this was necessary. Now, they haven't, ended that, and at some point here, when shelter in place in California is done or changes, I'm sure that order will be lifted, and then all the telehealth requirements will be back in place. The problem is, one thing with telehealth, there's lots of requirements in order to be in the telehealth space. Fortunately, most of the companies that are there are also subject to HIPAA, which has all sorts of security and privacy requirements. So the data that they're getting, these companies that were not complying with the telehealth requirements, and then started providing telehealth medicine after the order, all that data is going to be subject to HIPAA anyways. And so you're probably in an all right space as long as all the data that is, being compiled and whatever else. Are there security problems? Sure. There's all sorts of stuff. It's all being done over the internet, and a lot of these doctors, there's a reason these hospitals or doctors weren't giving telemedicine, is because they didn't align with the requirements under these laws. So is there a possibility that that data is out there and, subject to unauthorized disclosure and already has been? Sure. And there's probably not a lot of ways to fix that at this point. And so, people are just going to have to deal with that and cross your fingers and hope that it stayed secure. And that, the organizations that weren't certified under the telehealth medicine rules and practice, have taken the necessary steps. But, there's a gap there for sure.
Thank you. Do George or Stephen want to weigh in on anything here, or we can go to another question? No? All right, I was thinking in terms of the second part of the question, in terms of how do we increase internet capacity, and it's a difficult question because one of the reasons people aren't reaching doctors is because we're at stay at home or the doctors can't travel. So I was thinking it might be interesting to look at how we handled capacity building even 15 years ago, 20 years ago, before we had Wi-Fi, where there were telecenters set up, particularly in Latin America and Asia, internet cafes type environments where if people don't have direct access, they can go to a center, and of course there'd be rules about social distancing, but it might be easier for someone to go to a center with social distancing rules than for doctors to travel the circuit in rural and poor areas. That was one thought I had when I saw this question, that in fact, in terms of capacity building, perhaps we need to go a little old school. And I would also think too that, again, knowing what we know about capacity, that most people are accessing data through their phones and not through a laptop or a PC environment. And so I think the mobile app approach to telehealth would have to also be very carefully looked at and rolled out in a way that was cost effective, to Stephen's point, because there are increased costs to any of these questions responding to growth in infrastructure. whether it's physical infrastructure or whether it's technical, cloud-based infrastructure. It's a super tough question, but one worth asking.
I can maybe add something on that from
Sure.
a European perspective, at least. What's been interesting to see is how the European net neutrality regulations have been able to flex a little bit in these situations. So I believe that back a few years ago when the net neutrality regulation was established, health services, telemedicine, were defined as specialized services. So you could see that, there would be the ability to provide particular traffic management capacity or measures to allow for these very special high priority services. And I think this is probably where this is coming into play. And overall, with this whole COVID-ID, it's been interesting to see just how the net neutrality regulations have been able to flex a little bit to adapt to this COVID-19 situation. BEREC, which is European telecommunications regulator, which Joran will be very familiar with as a former chair, they've been issuing periodic reports about how the network across Europe has been able to cope and the different measures that mobile operators, fixed operators have been introducing in order to have that flexing capability to deal with different network surges and network demands. So I think those reports have been super interesting. They've actually matched what we've seen on the Cloudflare network as well, the different surges and return to normalization in some regions. But the telemedicine services, that's been interesting to see, and it's a real life case example of where specialized services indeed have come into play here.
Thank you, Caroline. We have two more questions from the chat, and then I'd like to ask a final round robin question. We have 4 more minutes. We may run a little over. If any of the speakers have a hard stop, please let me know. If not, what I think I'd like to do is ask the 2 audience questions and then one final round robin, if you're open. So from the audience, we have a participant from Macedonia. And he writes, the government of North Macedonia, together with the major telecom providers, is promoting tracking mobile apps to follow COVID spread and to help HCPs. I don't know what an HCP is, but let's assume it's a patient and healthcare providers, yes, which tackled wide discussion on privacy issues. The scale of information collected, how will the collectors, controllers, joint controllers, in terms of GDPR, EU, handle the data collected? Will this app turn off automatically? And I think Gretchen spoke a little bit about this in the US, but maybe shift a little to Europe. Will this app turn off automatically after cessation of state emergency? I would like to hear experiences and concerns.
I can try that one if you want.
All right, well, why don't we do Caroline and Gretchen?
Yeah, I'll take the European perspective at least. I mean, what has been super interesting for me is how quickly European authorities, in a slow-moving town that is Brussels, how quickly certain authorities like the European Data Protection Supervisor, the European Data Protection Board, the European Council, the Parliament, the Commission, all of them have come out very quickly with recommendations and toolkits on what these contact tracing apps should look like, and a lot of recommendations and guidelines. And I think, what everybody seems to be tilting towards, there are a couple of anomalies in terms of countries that aren't going in this general direction, but looking for a decentralized model and really pushing on the exact point that this is a very unique circumstance. So whatever we do in this period should be time limited, and data retention should be time limited. So there really should be a ring fence put around this really exceptional circumstance. But I think these authorities have acted extremely quickly to come up with guidelines from a data protection perspective, using the GDPR as a framework. So let's see, there are a bit of tussling between different member states as to which model they're going for. It seems like the decentralized model is gaining traction. I think a couple of countries like France and UK are maybe looking at it in a different way, but it's a super interesting discussion. Yeah, and of course Apple and Google are at the fore and pushing a particular model. But these are really strong privacy concerns, and I think this balance of security, privacy that is ever present in Europe, this kind of blurry line, this strange balance that we have in Europe, it's a really particularly now, you really see this, how challenging it is. For some people, security just means so much more. For others, privacy is coming to the fore. So we need to find that sort of happy medium.
Thank you, Caroline. I think that is sort of the nut of this as well. We talk about how governments are responding, but do we know what people want? Do we know what citizens want? Presuming that we would like to be traced, presuming, I think of that even beyond the governments. When you look at private sector and brands, and I've been using this example a lot because I think it's so interesting about the thermometer heat maps we see. When we have the Internet of Things and we have thermometers being able to take our temperature and then create a map that can help with epidemiological assessments, right? If you have that from the private sector, do you need it from the government too? Should the private sector and the government be working together? Is there, how does this play out? And I think it raises some very interesting policy questions from a democratic viewpoint in terms of what do citizens want, and also from how we allocate our very limited resources, which I think are shrinking even more as we see the economic impacts of COVID restrictions. So I think that's like an entire conversation about the security versus freedom. What do citizens want versus what the government wants? Gretchen, sure.
One point just to add there. The UK actually has been going through this, and the ICO just did an analysis and is continuing to do an analysis of the tracking app there, because there are just huge privacy and security concerns. So, security is one thing, like, great, you can encrypt everything, wonderful. But the fact of the matter is the sharing with the government as well as the private companies, and then what else is done with that data? How long is it retained? What type of control do the people have over the data? A lot of these apps are, coming out and saying, it's all anonymized, but you got to remember that a lot of companies out there have thousands of data points on each one of us. So when they say it's anonymized, sure, that information they're tracking, but they actually, a lot of companies can match that up with other data that they've already tracked from some other source on the internet or on our mobile devices. And so it's really difficult to say that any of these apps are truly collecting only anonymized data. They're just not, because then they're getting access to your contact list so that they can reach out to them. And then they're hiring all these people. All these states are hiring people so that they can go and contact everyone that you've come into contact with, and everything else. So, along with the geolocation, they're all going to do geolocation data as well. So, these are really, they could be really good if used correctly, but there has to be limitations on them. And right now, it's hard to see. Nobody's really putting these apps through their test yet to make sure. And that's why you see with ICO, they're struggling with it, and it's going to be really hard, I think, especially in the EU, probably easier here in the US because we're just more lax about this stuff. But in the EU, it's going to be really difficult, I think, to have these contract tracing apps to go forward.
Yeah, I thank you, Gretchen. And I think that also this discussion too about the limits of HIPAA inside the US, the Health Information Privacy Act, where the lines are drawn when a healthcare provider is not the only one doing the epidemiological study, right? The thermometer company's taking your temperature. So yeah, more things to talk about. There were two questions in the queue that were for Goran that were rather technical about the weighting of domains that you're looking at, and some of ICANN's comments, the organization's comments, the EPDP. What I'd like to do is take those offline since we've run a little overtime, and perhaps I can send them to you, Jorn, and you can provide answers that we can then either post on CircleID, or I can send directly to the people who are asking the questions. Because I do want to ask the last round robin, or if, again, if people have a little more time, we can extend this a few more minutes. But I do want everybody to have sort of a last word and not have the conversation completely dominated by ICANN policy, to be frank about it. But it is important policy nonetheless. So I'm going to let you think about that.
I'm very happy to answer the questions in writing.
In writing, okay, then I will do exactly that, forward them to you and we can post them. I apologize to the people who asked the questions, but we did run over time. And that being said, I do want to ask one more round robin question. We'll do it in reverse order in terms of responses. But how has COVID changed your thinking in terms of your approach to your job? What are the challenges? How are you doing something differently now that you weren't doing before in light of the magnitude of the problem, the severity, the limitations that we have for not being able to travel and engage the way we're used to? And I'll start with George.
So, you know, in terms of job, like most of the people here, I probably was on a plane every week or at most every other week. I sitting here at home day after day, I certainly find myself a lot more productive in many cases. But, you know, in terms of substance, I think COVID and all the restrictions that are in place and the long time span at which we have to deal with this has really given way to a lot of creative thinking. Like, people are thinking about issues in creative ways that they really haven't been forced to before. And I don't just mean workplace issues, but, you know, the real substantive legal issues. What does protection mean? You know, how much regulation should there be? What is the proper role of the state in closing businesses? You know, what sorts of rules do we have in place for this? And we really don't know. This is a pretty unprecedented time. So from the standpoint of a law professor, you know, this is a fertile time to be thinking about lots of really interesting issues, and hope that some of that contributes to solving them.
Thank you, George. Stephen.
Thanks, Laura. So my job has for a long time been a lot of facilitation of people's use of technology, generally anyway. But I guess I've come into a much greater appreciation about just the range of persons who need to use technology and the user experiences. I think Joran made a point earlier about engaging the end user, and that has actually become a much bigger aspect of what I've seen and have to respond to going forward. Because before now, I guess it would come down to only those who were in a position to, the technologically savvy, would be the ones that I'm interacting with. Now I'm interacting with those who never before considered themselves needing to or wanting to use technology. And things change a lot when you see people's understanding of what's available, how to use this, how to use that. Things which are normal to me aren't normal to them. So much a greater appreciation of where everyone is at, and the need for things to be simplified and made really, really accessible, so that even someone who would not normally avail themselves of certain things would be able to.
Thank you, Stephen. I think, again, going in reverse order, Gretchen.
I think I'm going to reiterate George's comment. I mean, we're just dealing with really interesting legal issues. My job has not changed other than the legal issues with COVID, and it's opened up a lot of interesting gray areas, which we were already dealing with a lot of gray areas on privacy. So just more gray areas, but how I practice, you know, other than doing more of this rather than in-person meetings, I miss, you know, I never thought I'd say this, I actually miss seeing the people I work with. I like going and shutting my door, but, you know, that's one thing. I do a lot more of this. But my practice itself, no, hasn't really changed. It's just a lot more issues.
Thank you. And that takes us back to Joran.
Thank you. This is a very tough question in a way, because, but I would say that one of the trends I'm seeing, apart from the focus on the end user, is actually the sort of filtering out. I don't know about you guys, but I have a feeling that right now we are dealing. I mean, ICANN, both at the org and the institutional level, we're dealing with a lot of things. But it seems we are focusing on some really important things, and maybe some of the less relevant things is getting sort of filtered out, because people want to. We feel a need to sort out some of the issues that have been around. Sometimes the issues have been around for a very, very long time, and it's just that when the storm calms, sort of, you see all those things that floats around. And the storm, I mean, I don't travel that much. The ICANN community doesn't travel that much. We don't commute. It suddenly gives us time to do and reflect on things we haven't done before. Apart from that, my life is, I mean, I like everybody else, I'm locked into a room. My community members are still barking at me. I have 2 dogs at home. So there's a lot of things that is the same. But I think that when I see this filtering and prioritization thing that is happening right now, and I think that's very good for us. I'm also quite bored, I can admit that, by sitting at home and not meeting people. I even miss the office coffee. That's a stretch, believe me.
That's funny because Caroline posted a blog recently about the Brussels coffee.
You saw that?
Yes, I did. I keep up with my colleagues, so how she misses that coffee hour. So I will, that's a good segue to Caroline having the first word and the last word.
Yeah, that's exactly what I miss. I mean, while a lot of the work can be done online, particularly within the Cloudflare company, Brussels is a very social town. I mean, that's what you do. You get out and about. You meet in the coffee shop. You get the leaked document. You get the tip. You get the information. You get the endorsement and support. So yeah, I definitely miss that human element. I never want that to disappear. You know, I think we can probably take from this that we can bring more balance to our lives. Certainly a lot more can go online. We probably don't need to jet around the world as much as we do, but human interaction at the end of the day, there's not much that can place that for certain engagements. But it's definitely brought a lot more focus to the work, and the team creativity has been quite impressive. And most of all, I'm just super proud of the internet. I mean, the ability of the internet to flex and respond to this unusual situation. I haven't got to discuss any of the things that we've seen in the network, but we've built a website built for this.net, where we've had observations on the internet, different things that we've seen. But just the ability of the internet to accommodate these surges in traffic, which came almost overnight in many respects, has been phenomenal. And it really gives me a lot of confidence that we can tackle anything now once we've been through this.
Thank you, Caroline. I think that's a very good note to end the session. I want to thank everybody for their time and for being able to jump on and, you know, such short notice. And it's really been enlightening. And I've taken a lot of notes. And what we're hoping to do is formulate more questions, and perhaps we'll have some of you back to follow up, because we didn't even get to trends and a whole bunch of other questions. But I think this was a great first effort, and I'm going to end the session and end the meeting, but I want to really extend a hearty thank you, and thank you for all the hard work you're doing. We've got so much more to do, but I'm very excited for the day that we'll actually have our dinner and our glass of wine again, and just wishing you all just a very nice day. Thank you, and this will end the meeting.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Lori.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks all. Bye.